The Missouri Supreme Court sets an execution date for a man accused of raping and murdering a 9-year-old girl in southwest Missouri. In 2012, a jury convicted Christopher Collings of the 2007 abduction, rape, and murder of Rowan Ford of Stella, Missouri.
The execution chamber inside Eastern Reception Diagnostic and Correctional Center was colder than most people imagined. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just silent. A silence so heavy that every small sound became impossible to ignore. The shuffle of shoes, the squeak of rubber gloves, the restrained breathing of witnesses waiting behind thick glass. And at the center of it all sat Christopher Collings, a man the state of Missouri said had committed one of the most horrifying crimes in its modern history. For years, his name had lived inside court documents, police reports, and death penalty debates. But on this night, there would be no more appeals, no more motions, no more delays, just minutes. Outside the prison walls, the world moved normally. Cars passed, restaurants stayed open, people scrolled through their phones without ever hearing his name. But inside that room, time slowed down, because executions do that. They force everyone involved to stare directly at something society usually keeps hidden: death, punishment, finality. And for the family of a little girl named Roden family victim, this night was supposed to bring an ending they had waited years to see. But endings like this are never clean, because the story that brought Christopher Collings to death row did not begin with a monster lurking in shadows. It began with trust, a friendship, a family connection, a man welcomed into familiar spaces, which somehow made what happened next feel even darker. According to investigators, Christopher Collings was not a stranger to the victim's family. He knew them. He'd spent time around them. There was familiarity there, the kind that lowers defenses without people realizing it. And that detail would haunt Missouri for years. Because when the case exploded into headlines, the public focused on one unbearable question. How could someone close to the family do something so brutal to a 9-year-old child? The crime happened in the year 2007. At first, the little girl was simply missing. And whenever a child disappears, the first few hours become pure chaos. Family members call everyone they know. Police scramble to build timelines. Neighbors step outside, pretending not to panic while secretly imagining the worst. But the worst came quickly. Investigators discovered the child had been taken and murdered in a rural area of Missouri. Reports later revealed horrifying details surrounding the crime. Details so disturbing many local news stations softened their coverage because of the victim's age. The state argued that Christopher Collings abducted the girl, sexually assaulted her, and ultimately killed her before leaving her body near a wooded area. The brutality shocked even veteran investigators. And almost immediately, outrage consumed the case. In small-town America, crimes against children spread through communities like fire. Fear turns personal. Parents stop letting kids walk alone. School conversations become tense. People begin checking locks twice before sleeping. But this case carried something else too: betrayal. Because prosecutors claimed the victim knew Christopher Collings, trusted him, had no reason to fear him at first. That single detail transformed public anger into something deeper, something colder. As police closed in, investigators gathered physical evidence, witness testimony, and statements they believed tied Collings directly to the murder. Prosecutors later described the evidence as overwhelming. But death penalty cases are never simple. Not legally, not morally, not emotionally. Years later, Collings' attorneys would argue about mental health issues, childhood trauma, intellectual limitations, and whether execution truly served justice after decades behind bars. Anti-death penalty groups raised familiar questions. Does another death heal anything? Does execution create justice or simply another grave? Meanwhile, supporters of the sentence pointed toward the age of the victim. 9 years old, a child. For many people, that fact alone ended the debate. And that is why Christopher Collings became one of the most controversial execution cases in Missouri in recent years. Because once the legal system labels someone responsible for the murder of a child, public sympathy almost disappears completely. Still, death, Roe changes people. Years inside a concrete cell can erode identity itself. Men age differently there. They speak slower, move slower, think slower. Some become religious. Some become bitter. Some disappear into silence long before execution day arrives. And as Christopher Collings waded through appeal after appeal, the world outside continued moving without him. Presidents changed. Phones evolved. Entire social media platforms were born while he sat in prison. But the case never truly vanished. Every few years, another appeal would bring the story back into headlines. Another reminder of the little girl who never got the chance to grow up. Another reminder that somewhere inside Missouri's prison system sat the man convicted of taking that future away. Then finally, after years of legal battles, the execution date was set. And once a date is officially placed on the calendar, death row becomes different. Sharper, more real. Because until then, inmates can still pretend time is endless. But after the date arrives, every sunrise starts feeling numbered. Christopher Collings now knew exactly how many mornings he had left. And according to reports from inside the prison system, preparations quietly began. Final visitation procedures, final legal reviews, final meal discussions, final spiritual requests. The machinery of execution had started moving, and it almost never stops once it begins. But before Missouri carried out the sentence, before witnesses entered the chamber, before Christopher Collings spoke his final words, there was still one question hanging over the entire case. A question that had divided people for years. Was this execution justice? Or was it simply revenge wearing the uniform of the law? Long before the execution chamber, before the headlines, before Missouri prepared the lethal injection, there was only a little girl, 9 years old, still young enough to laugh loudly without embarrassment, still young enough to believe adults were supposed to protect her. That innocence became one of the most painful parts of the entire case, because investigators would later say Christopher Collings used familiarity and trust to get close to the victim before her disappearance. And in crimes involving children, betrayal often terrifies the public more than violence itself. Not because it is rare, but because it feels possible anywhere. The day the little girl vanished began like an ordinary day in rural Missouri. No one around her family could have imagined that within hours, police cars, helicopters, and investigators would flood the area searching for a missing child. At first, people hoped she had simply wandered away. That happens sometimes. Children get distracted, lose track of time, hide somewhere, and accidentally scare everyone. But experienced officers often say families can feel when something is wrong. And according to reports from the investigation, panic spread quickly. Search teams were organized. Volunteers arrived. Roads and wooded areas were checked. Then attention slowly turned toward people connected to the family, including Christopher Collings. Investigators later stated that his behavior during questioning raised suspicions almost immediately. Authorities believed parts of his story did not match timelines or witness accounts. As pressure increased, police began focusing heavily on him. And eventually, investigators uncovered evidence they said connected him directly to the crime. The discovery of the victim's body devastated the community. Even hardened officers reportedly struggled emotionally with the scene. Crimes involving children often affect investigators differently. Many officers later admit those cases follow them home. Some remember the faces forever, because no amount of training fully prepares someone to see innocence destroyed. Prosecutors later described the murder in horrifying detail during trial proceedings. According to the state, the child had been abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered before her body was abandoned in a remote area. The courtroom reportedly became emotional multiple times as evidence was presented. Some family members cried openly. Others stared silently at the floor. And throughout the trial, the victim's age remained central to everything. 9 years old, old enough to trust, too young to understand danger fully. The prosecution painted Christopher Collings as a predator who exploited access to the family. They argued the crime was calculated, brutal, and deserving of the harshest punishment Missouri law allowed. The defense took a different path. Attorneys focused heavily on Collings' background and mental condition. They argued he suffered from severe trauma, cognitive limitations, and psychological issues dating back to childhood. Like many death penalty cases, the trial slowly transformed into two separate arguments happening at once. The first asked, did he commit the crime? The second asked, if he did, should the state kill him for it? For the victim's family, however, the answer seemed obvious. Their daughter was gone forever. No appeal could reverse that. No prison sentence could restore birthdays, graduations, or future. And that emotional reality heavily influenced public opinion across Missouri. When jurors ultimately recommended death, many people believed the outcome had been inevitable from the beginning. Still, death sentences carry a strange weight inside courtrooms. Even after terrible evidence is presented, silence usually follows. Because everyone understands what the sentence truly means. Not prison, not life behind bars. Death. A scheduled death controlled by the government itself. Christopher Collings was officially sent to Missouri's death row, where he would spend years waiting inside one of the most isolated environments in the American prison system. And over time, his case became part of the larger national debate surrounding capital punishment. Some believed execution was the only appropriate response for crimes against children. Others believed no government should have the power to deliberately end a human life, even someone convicted of horrific violence. But while politicians argued, while activists debated, while courts reviewed appeals, the victim's family continued living with absence. An empty chair at holidays, a missing voice, a child frozen in memory forever at 9 years old. And eventually, after years of legal delays, Missouri reached its final decision. Christopher Collings would die by lethal injection. The date was set, and suddenly, the countdown became real. Death row is not loud the way movies make people think. There are no constant screams, no endless violence echoing through the halls. Most of the time, it is silence, heavy silence, the kind that slowly changes a person over years. After receiving his death sentence, Christopher Collings entered Missouri's prison system as a condemned man. From that point forward, every part of his life became controlled by schedules, locked doors, and routine. Wake up, count, meals, isolation, lights out, then repeat, again and again, for years. Inside Potosi Correctional Center, where Missouri housed many death row inmates for years, life moved differently than the outside world. Time there did not feel normal. Men measured life not through holidays or birthdays, but through appeals. One hearing could mean another year alive. One denied motion could suddenly make execution feel dangerously close. For Christopher Collings, the appeals process stretched across years. His attorneys challenged various aspects of the case, including mental health concerns and whether his execution would violate constitutional protections. Death penalty cases in America often become long legal wars, not because the courts doubt every conviction, but because once the state executes someone, there is no undo button. No correction, no apology, no reversal. That finality is exactly why executions receive more scrutiny than almost any other punishment. During those years, Collings reportedly spent much of his time inside a small concrete cell. Former inmates and prison staff often described death row as psychologically exhausting rather than physically chaotic. The waiting becomes torture itself. Some inmates stop sleeping normally. Some lose the ability to handle conversation. Others become obsessed with routines because routines are the only thing they can still control. And then there is the strangest part of death row, watching other inmates disappear. One day a man is walking the tier. Weeks later his cell is empty forever. Executions create ghosts long before anyone dies. Meanwhile, outside prison walls, the victim's family continued carrying grief through ordinary life. Years may pass after a murder, but families often describe trauma as something frozen in time, especially when the victim was a child. Every birthday becomes painful. Every school graduation reminds them what never happened. And unlike prison inmates, grieving families do not receive appeals, delays, or emotional distance from the crime. They relive it constantly. As the years passed, Christopher Collings' case slowly faded from national attention. New crimes replaced old headlines. News cycles moved on. But in Missouri, officials continued preparing for the possibility that one day the sentence would finally be carried out. Then eventually, after repeated legal efforts failed, the execution date became official. And according to former death row inmates, everything changes once that happens. The atmosphere changes first. Guards behave differently. Lawyers visit more often. Religious advisors begin appearing. Even other inmates notice it immediately. Because once a date is assigned, the state is no longer discussing death as a possibility. It becomes an appointment. Reports surrounding Christopher Collings' final months indicated legal teams continued fighting to stop the execution. Defense attorneys argued about mental illness, trauma, and whether executing him truly served justice after so many years imprisoned. Anti-death penalty organizations also pushed publicly for clemency. But prosecutors and supporters of the sentence pointed back toward the crime itself. A 9-year-old child murdered. For many people, no additional argument mattered beyond that. Missouri officials ultimately refused to halt the execution. And slowly, Christopher Collings approached the final stage every death row inmate secretly fears most. The final week. Former prison staff have described condemned inmates becoming unusually calm during those last days. Some pray constantly. Some withdraw completely. Others suddenly become emotional after years of appearing numb. Reality finally breaks through, because at that point, there are almost no legal options left. Only procedure. Final visitation lists. Final meal paperwork. Final spiritual counseling. And somewhere inside that prison, Christopher Collings now understood something terrifying with absolute certainty. For years, execution had existed as a distant future. Now, it had become a clock. The last day on death row does not look dramatic at first. No alarms, no shouting, no cinematic goodbye speeches echoing through prison walls. Just procedure. Cold, methodical procedure. For Christopher Collings, the final 24 hours reportedly unfolded inside one of the most controlled environments in the Missouri prison system. By then, there were almost no legal moves remaining. His attorneys had fought for years through appeals and motions, challenging the death sentence and raising concerns surrounding mental health and trauma. But the courts had rejected the final attempts to stop the execution. The state was moving forward. And once that process reaches its final stage, everything becomes scheduled down to the minute. Former corrections officers often describe execution day as emotionally strange, even for prison staff. Some officers avoid eye contact with a condemned inmate. Others become unusually polite. Because regardless of the crime, everyone understands they are walking beside someone who will soon be dead. Inside the prison, Christopher Collings was transferred into the execution watch area. In many death penalty cases, inmates are monitored closely during these final hours to prevent self-harm or suicide attempts before the sentence can be carried out. The irony is difficult to ignore. For years, the state keeps a man alive, only to later prepare carefully for his death. During those final hours, condemned inmates are typically offered visits with attorneys, spiritual advisors, and selected family members. Some inmates cry during these meetings. Some apologize. Some stay emotionally detached. Others spend the entire visit pretending death is not approaching at all. Reports surrounding Christopher Collings suggested he remained relatively quiet as the execution neared. And silence on death row can mean many things. Acceptance, fear, exhaustion, or simply emptiness after years of waiting. Outside the prison, media crews began gathering near the facility. Activists on both sides of the death penalty debate also arrived. That scene has become common in American executions. On one side stand people demanding justice for victims. On the other stand opponents of capital punishment arguing the state should never kill in the name of law. Sometimes they pray. Sometimes they protest. Sometimes they yell at each other across barricades, while television cameras record everything. But inside the victim's family, emotions are usually far more complicated than public slogans. Because executions rarely erase grief. They only mark another painful chapter in it. For the family of the 9-year-old victim, this was not a political debate. This was the final legal step in a nightmare that had haunted them since 2007. A child taken forever. A future erased. And now the man convicted of causing that pain was approaching his final moments alive. As evening approached, prison officials began the final preparations. Execution chambers in America are intentionally clinical. Officials try to remove visible emotion from the process. Bright lights, medical equipment, structured movements, everything designed to feel controlled. Almost sterile. But no matter how clean the room looks, one truth always hangs in the air. Someone is about to die there. Witnesses were organized into separate viewing areas. Typically, these include media representatives, state officials, and members connected to the victim's family. Each witness enters knowing they are about to observe something most human beings never see firsthand. A legal execution. And despite years of public debate surrounding lethal injection, the reality often unsettles even people who support the death penalty. Because death inside an execution chamber does not feel symbolic once you are standing there. It feels physical, real breathing, real fear, real finality. Meanwhile, somewhere beyond prison fences, most of America continued its normal evening completely unaware that Missouri was preparing to execute another inmate. That contrast always feels disturbing. An ordinary night for millions, and the last night alive for one man. Then finally, as the clock moved closer to the scheduled execution time, Christopher Collings was informed the process would proceed. No more delays, no miracle appeals, no last-second intervention. The countdown had ended, and for the first time in years, even death row itself became quiet around him, because everyone there understood what came next. The walk to the execution chamber. There's a moment before every execution when everything suddenly feels real. Not when the date is announced, not when appeals fail, but when the cell door finally opens. For Christopher Collings, that moment came inside the Missouri prison system on the night the state prepared to carry out his death sentence for the murder of a 9-year-old girl. Former corrections officers often describe the walk as one of the eeriest parts of the entire process, because by then, everyone already knows the ending. The inmate knows. The guards know. The witnesses know. And yet the ritual still continues carefully, step by step, exactly according to procedure. Reports from executions across the United States often describe condemned inmates being escorted by multiple officers through secured hallways toward the chamber. The atmosphere is usually controlled and quiet. No dramatic resistance. No screaming. Most inmates walk calmly, not because they are fearless, but because there is nowhere left to run. Christopher Collings had now spent years waiting for this exact night. Years waking up inside a concrete cell, knowing the state intended to eventually end his life. And after enough time, even unimaginable things start becoming psychologically real. The prison staff completed final identification procedures. Officials confirmed names, paperwork, and legal authorization for the execution. Every detail mattered, because modern executions are designed to appear procedural rather than emotional. The state does not present itself as angry, only official. Witnesses slowly entered the viewing rooms separated by thick glass. Among them were media representatives and individuals connected to the victim's family, people who had waited years for this night. For some family members of murder victims, executions bring closure. For others, they change nothing at all. Many later admit the emotional emptiness afterward surprised them, because revenge and healing are not always the same thing. Inside the chamber itself, the lighting remained bright. Execution rooms are often intentionally plain, almost medical in appearance. A gurney at the center, restraints, medical tubing, officials positioned around the room. Everything prepared in advance. And then Christopher Collings entered. Witnesses at executions often describe the same strange realization during that moment. The condemned inmate suddenly looks less like a headline and more like a human being, older than expected, smaller than expected, tired. Years on death, row change people physically. Isolation, stress, and time wear down the body long before execution day arrives. But for supporters of the sentence, sympathy ended the moment they remembered why he was there. A 9-year-old child had lost her life. That fact overshadowed everything else. According to official procedures, Christopher Collings was secured onto the execution gurney while prison staff prepared the lethal injection process. At that point, the room usually becomes extremely quiet. Even witnesses who strongly support executions often stop speaking entirely. Because once the inmate is restrained, the state is no longer threatening death, is preparing to cause it. Then came one of the most uncomfortable traditions in the American execution system. Final words. Some inmates apologize. Some quote religion. Some attack the legal system. Some say nothing at all. Those final statements often become the last remaining piece of control condemned inmates still possess. Reports indicated Christopher Collings delivered brief final remarks before the execution proceeded. Like many final statements on death row, the words immediately spread through news coverage afterward as journalists rushed to document every detail. Then officials gave the order to begin. The lethal injection process started. Witnesses watched carefully through the glass as prison staff administered the drugs designed to end his life. And no matter how clinical executions appear on paper, witnessing one in person reportedly feels completely different. Because behind the legal language, behind the debates, behind the politics, a living person slowly stops breathing in front of you. Minutes later, Christopher Collings was pronounced dead by the state of Missouri. The execution was over. But outside the prison walls, another question immediately returned. After all these years, did anyone truly feel peace now? Once the execution ended, the room did not suddenly feel victorious. That is something many witnesses later describe after watching a legal execution for the first time. There is no dramatic sense of triumph, no emotional release like movies portray. Usually, there is just silence, heavy silence. After Christopher Collings was pronounced dead by the state of Missouri, officials quietly completed the final procedures that follow every execution. Time of death was recorded. Witnesses were escorted out. Paperwork began immediately. Inside the prison, staff returned to routine astonishingly fast. Because prisons cannot stop functioning after an execution. Guards still work shifts. Doors still open and close. Meals still move through the halls. And somewhere else on death row, other inmates remained inside their cells listening carefully, fully aware that another condemned man had just disappeared forever. Former inmates have said executions changed the atmosphere across an entire prison for days afterward. Some prisoners become quieter. Others cannot sleep. Some pretend not to care at all. But everyone notices, because death row inmates live with a terrifying understanding. One day, the footsteps outside the cell may come for them too. Outside the prison gates, reporters rush to publish updates. Headlines spread quickly across television broadcasts and online news sites. Missouri had carried out another execution. And almost immediately, the public reaction divided into familiar camps once again. Some people believed justice had finally been served. Others condemned the execution entirely, arguing that state-sanctioned death only continues cycles of violence rather than ending them. That argument has followed the American death penalty system for decades. Supporters often focus on the victims. Opponents often focus on morality, wrongful convictions, or whether governments should possess the authority to deliberately kill prisoners. But cases involving murdered children create especially intense reactions, because public sympathy overwhelmingly centers on innocence lost. For many people, the details surrounding the murder of a 9-year-old girl erased nearly all possibility of forgiveness. And yet, even in horrific cases, executions continue raising uncomfortable ethical questions. Can a government kill without becoming part of the violence itself? Does punishment equal healing? Can closure truly exist after something irreversible? Families of murder victims answer those questions differently. Some relatives later say executions finally allowed them to breathe again after years of court hearings and trauma. Others admit the emotional emptiness afterward shocked them, because the victim still does not return. The chair at the dinner table remains empty. Birthdays still hurt. Photographs still freeze time permanently. Death cannot reverse death. For the victim's loved ones in this case, however, the execution marked the legal end of a nightmare stretching back to 2007. No more appeals. No more hearings. No more chances the sentence could change. Christopher Collings was gone. But as journalists revisited the case after the execution, another detail resurfaced repeatedly: the role of trust. Investigators had long argued the victim knew him. That familiarity allowed him access. That the child had no reason to initially feel danger. That aspect continued haunting people far beyond Missouri. Because strangers are easy to fear, trusted people are not. And statistically, many crimes against children are committed not by unknown predators hiding in darkness, but by individuals already connected to victims in everyday life. Friends, neighbors, relatives, family acquaintances. That reality frightens parents far more than random horror stories ever could. Meanwhile, anti-death penalty advocates use the execution to renew criticism of capital punishment nationwide. Organizations opposing executions argued America continued spending enormous amounts of money and legal resources maintaining a system many countries had already abolished. But supporters responded with one brutal point: what punishment should exist for someone convicted of murdering a child? That question has never received a universal answer, and it likely never will, because death penalty debates are rarely just legal. They are emotional, personal, moral, sometimes even spiritual. And long after Christopher Collings died inside Missouri's execution chamber, the larger argument surrounding his case continued living far beyond prison walls. An argument about justice, mercy, and whether human beings ever truly know the line between them. By the end of the night, the prison looked ordinary again. The lights still glowed across the fences. Guards still changed shifts. Metal doors still slammed shut somewhere deep inside the facility. And yet one cell now stood empty forever. Christopher Collings was gone. Another execution added to American history. Another condemned inmate reduced to headlines, statistics, archived footage, and legal records. But the real weight of this story never belonged to the execution chamber. It belonged to a little girl who never got the chance to grow older. That is what makes cases like this linger in people's minds long after media coverage disappears. Not the courtroom, not the appeals, not even the execution itself, but the stolen future. Somewhere in another version of life, that 9-year-old child could have grown up by now. Maybe she would have graduated school. Maybe she would have fallen in love. Maybe she would have become a mother herself one day. Instead, time stopped for her in 2007. Forever. And that is the cruelest thing about crimes involving children. The victims remain frozen at one age while the rest of the world keeps moving without them. Years pass. Parents grow older. Friends change. Cities evolve. But in family photographs, the child never changes at all. As news coverage surrounding the execution spread online, public reactions once again revealed how divided America remains over the death penalty. Some comments celebrated the execution openly. Others questioned whether another death solved anything. And somewhere between those two sides sits an uncomfortable truth many people do not want to admit. There are some crimes so horrifying that society struggles to decide what justice is supposed to even look like anymore. Prison forever? Execution? Mercy? Retribution? No answer ever feels complete. Because punishment cannot rewind time. It cannot restore birthdays. It cannot erase trauma. It cannot return a child to her family. At best, it simply marks society's final response to irreversible violence. And maybe that is why executions continue haunting people even when they believe the sentence was justified. Because witnessing state-sanctioned death forces society to confront itself. Its anger, its grief, its morality, its limits. For years, Christopher Collings lived inside a concrete cell waiting for the state of Missouri to decide the exact day he would die. Then eventually that day arrived, just like it has for hundreds of condemned inmates across the United States. And after every execution, the same question quietly survives. Did justice happen here? Or did tragedy simply reach its final chapter? People answer differently depending on who they are. Victims' families, prison staff, activists, jurors, religious leaders. Everyone carries their own version of justice. But perhaps the darkest part of this entire story is how ordinary evil sometimes appears before revealing itself. According to prosecutors, Christopher Collings was not a stranger lurking in shadows. He was someone connected to the family, someone trusted enough to be near the victim. And history has shown repeatedly that human beings often fear monsters they can recognize, while overlooking the ones that already stand inside familiar rooms. That truth unsettles people far more than prison walls ever could, because it means danger does not always arrive wearing a warning sign. Sometimes it arrives smiling, talking normally, acting familiar, until one terrible moment changes multiple lives forever. Now the case is over legally. The execution happened. The appeals ended. The state closed the file. But for the people left behind, endings are never that simple. Some wounds do not disappear with verdicts. Some grief survives every courtroom. Some questions never fully die. And somewhere tonight, another prison cell in America holds another condemned inmate staring at the ceiling in silence, waiting for their own final date with history.